Welcome to Africa's Vision Network. My name is Omar Ashaka, your guest host. Africa's Vision Network features programs that deal with the African and African American world. Programs featured on education, finance, adoption, and many other topics that impact our world. We have a very, very unique show today, and it's simply called Ebola. Our special guest is a very interesting gentleman. His name is Belai Habte-Jesus. Welcome to Africa's Vision Network.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to having this discussion with you because Ebola, in view of the fact it's recently come to America, a lot of Americans are concerned, confused, and so we just want to get your perspective. But tell our audience a little bit first about who you are, where you've come from, and your background.
Okay. Thank you again for this opportunity to share my perspective on Ebola, what we call zoonotic diseases that are transferred from animals or to humans. In effect, the normal habitat or host environment is other animals. They're not humans. Okay. And therefore, when they move from animals to humans, they give disease processes because the human body is not ready for them, is not exposed to them, and therefore they have a fertile ground for multiplication, and as such then damage the human body and the human being. Okay. So having said that, my name is Belai Habte-Jesus. I'm a medical doctor. I have MD and MPH. I've lived and worked in 4 continents. Started in Ethiopia and then India. I was at Christian Medical College, Vellore, South India. It's one of the most celebrated medical school in the whole of Southeast Asia, run by Christians, Christian missionaries, and therefore it has supporters from all denominations, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestants, and what have you. And its main vision and mission is to prepare doctors for the service of the ministry. Then I went to England to do a master's in public health at the University of Leeds, Yorkshire. That's North England, where I got my master's in evaluation of mother and child health services across the world in developing and developed countries. And my research mainly shows 2 factors. For any child or baby to survive and to grow into adulthood, it requires 2 basic stuff, everything being equal. And there are biological factors, social factors, economical factors. And I looked at all the ingredients across the world. And the most important factor is the mother's birth weight, what we call the biological determinant, okay, which is dependent on the mother's grandparents, okay, grandmother's birth weight. And the second one was the mother's education. Okay. Surprisingly, the role of the man, besides donating maybe his genetic pool, was very little.
Belai, that's very interesting. You mentioned England, you mentioned India, so clearly you've got a very diverse background in terms of your training. You've seen a lot. Now, Ebola, you also talked about the mother, who's is a focal point here. You talked about the biological aspect of the mother. You talked about the education. And when I think about Ebola, because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa and Niger, and I know what the educational challenges can be. I know what some of the health practices can be in terms of the limitations. But because this is a very dynamic subject, I want to try to really tie in and make this as crystal clear as possible to our audience who might be looking so they can understand Ebola. You talked about an animal. There's a term you use, and I can't recall the term. What was that?
Zoonotic.
Okay, zoonotic. Now, is that a medical term?
Yes, it's like the zoo.
Okay, zoonotic.
So
okay.
Zoonotic.
Okay, and that's interesting. I never heard that before. Is that something that we're faced with on a regular basis, especially
yes,
maybe in third world countries, or just throughout the world?
No, it's across the world.
Okay.
What we mean by zoonotic disease are diseases that stem from animals. They normally would do no harm to the animals. Mm-hmm. However, when they jump from one animal to the other, especially from animals to humans, they thrive much more in human environment, therefore cause lots of damage. So we can go through the whole series of these diseases. Ebola is found normally healthy in fruit bats, in antelopes,
Okay, and for
and lots of other animals,
Right.
but it doesn't harm those animals.
Yeah, but I want to make sure too that our audience understands some of these key points. You mentioned the fruit bat.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure if we see a lot of fruit bats in America. Can you talk a little
All
bit?
right. In 1976, the 200th American independence, when Jimmy Carter was president. I remember it very clearly because that was the time I left on July 4th, Ethiopia, to study medicine in India.
Okay.
And that very weekend, there was this explosion of Ebola in the Sudan, at the Sudan-Congo interface, or at the border there. And what happened was, in the Sudan, there was this big mill, sort of a cotton factory.
Mm-hmm.
In that cotton factory, in a village setting, there were fruit bats, more or less living in the roofs of those factory.
Mm-hmm.
And the person who was actually in the storekeeper, was the first person who got sick. Either there was a fruit bat that died and he touched it, but he had some contact. And very soon the people he worked with, his families, and over 276 people died at that time. And WHO and other experts went to the Sudan, and then the disease went to Congo. So this was a disease that's been there 40 years ago when it was first identified.
Okay.
So it was the start of my medical career, the time when I left my country, and it was happening next to Ethiopia in the Sudan-Congo border.
Okay.
Then since then, it has come and gone, and the WHO knew how to deal with this issue. In fact, they used the normal strategies that we're doing, the prevention strategies, and contained the disease.
And Belai, because time is moving on too, and we want to get as much information as possible, but this is fascinating. You said the WHO, they knew about this fruit bat. Let me ask you this, quickly. In America, where would we find fruit bats?
Well,
if at all.
I would not be exactly sure where specifically, but fruit bats normally, or bats in general, live in caves, in forests. That's where they live, and I'm sure we have them a lot here as well.
We do have caves,
yes.
So yeah. Okay.
Now, these Ebola virus is an RNA virus. That means it doesn't have a DNA. It needs the DNA to survive, and therefore this virus lives normally among these animals, and it doesn't normally hurt these animals. The tragedy comes when humans are in contact with animals, and they then had the opportunity to have the viruses enter their body. And because we humans do not have antibodies, or we have no experience with this virus, the virus thrives in our system and literally multiplies in our blood system, and our body tries to fight it. And that's why initially all the white blood cells, our defense system, like our soldiers, go to fight this. In the process, actually the virus takes over and the body bleeds. So you have pain because of the inflammation, and then vomiting, diarrhea, and actually bleeding in our skin, in our eyes, and everywhere. And so this disease has been around for 40 years.
Right, but let's take it. Let's make it a little more current in terms of the outbreak in Liberia, Guinea, and maybe Sierra Leone. Now, what I need to be clear on too, though, Belai, because you mentioned the animals. My experience, again, when I lived in Africa, a lot of the people dealing with animals is kind of like daily life, the different types of animals. So I want to be as clear as possible too. I understand where you're coming from with the fruit bats, but what about the sheep, the cows, the other animals that they deal with on a daily basis that might be running around in the yard or whatever in some areas?
Yes, as you know, humans have always dealt with animals. Right. Some of them, we call them wild animals. We meet them in the wild, and sometimes we keep them in a zoo. The name zoonotic comes from there. And some we domesticate, and they live with us. And in Africa especially, people live together in the same room with birds, chicken, or with cows, or sheep and goats. So from time to time, we exchange some of these little parasites, be it the little insects or beetles, or sometimes bacteria and viruses. And therefore, over time, we adapted to these new situations. But this special virus was actually in the fruit fly, in the fruit bat, and that obviously we have very little contact with bats as it was. So it had the opportunity to enter into the human system, and then it gradually spread with human contact, especially body fluid contact, because that's where the virus thrives. This virus, comparatively to HIV, is a much more stronger virus. HIV, as you know, on its own, on dry surface, cannot survive more than 20 seconds. This one can do so for more than 2 to 3 hours. Hepatitis C can stay there for a few more days. So comparatively, this virus is a little bit stronger than, say, the HIV virus.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned HIV because I just had a thought on that. I'm not sure if it's accurate, but there are those who feel like HIV was a man-made virus, but that's a whole nother discussion. In Liberia, as far as you know, I mean, because you're talking about the fruit bat, obviously I haven't looked at TV 24 hours to cover, in terms of coverage, but I've never heard that mentioned. As far as you know, is the fruit bat very prevalent in Liberia and other countries?
I wanted to make sure the story that the WHO has discovered in Africa, I mean in the Sudan, was fruit bat. But this virus is also found in monkeys, gorillas, in antelopes, in different animals. So the virus variant that's found in West Africa could be slightly different than the one from the Sudan and the Congo. And in fact, the word Ebola comes from the river where these patients were first identified. Once it moved from the Sudanese southwestern part of the Sudan to the northeast part of the Congo. So Ebola is the name of the river where these people used to live. So the name comes from there. However, these hemorrhagic viruses that we call them, it's not only Ebola, there are other viruses as well. Lassa fever and some other fevers have, some other viruses have actually names from Germany and Belgium, where the Institute of Public Health identified these viruses. So this virus has been known in the medical community, especially with the WHO, for quite some time. What the issue is, appropriate measures that were, what we call naturally global, to make sure appropriate vaccines were developed or treatment modules were developed. This is one of those what they call, not so famous or not so popular diseases that actually cannot be addressed because the population it addresses are rural, small communities that the world doesn't know very much about, and therefore the vaccine and other programs were shelved because the virus was stopped at the time, 40 years ago. But from then on up to now, it's been coming and going. There will be a small outbreak, and then it subsides.
Right, but Belai, we also have to look at the fact, because it is, and I'm sure I would assume you will agree with this, because it's a third world country. I mean, because when you're talking about vaccine, unless maybe some pharmaceutical company wants to do some trial, which from what I understand they do a lot of trial, use drugs on a trial basis in the third world country. But we know money is an issue, but I still want to try to focus in on what took place in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, because you mentioned, if I heard you correctly, there are a number of viruses. So I'm even wondering, they talk about thousands of people have died of Ebola. And again, I can't, even though it's been many, many years, I can't help but go back to my Peace Corps experience. And it's not like we have over there, from what I understand, I know they may have a health ministry, but I don't believe it's as sophisticated as over here where we can even track these diseases. So when you talk about multiple viruses, I'm even wondering, are they lumping some of everything is maybe not even related to Ebola?
I would say confidently at the moment that the virus that is identified in West Africa is Ebola virus. There's no doubt about that. I think the question that we should address is, does the Ebola virus have the right to live? This is a question that we have to ask ourselves. And what is the habitat, the environment where these viruses live? we also have the right to live. We have our own design ecosystem and lifestyles that we manage. However, if humans go into the territory of these wild animals and these viruses, the viruses didn't jump on us. I mean, we came in contact with the virus, and we should look at the whole ecological environment. I think what we should be very concerned about is how can we ensure our own ecosystem, the human ecosystem, to be safe and secure, and if there are infections or diseases that happen, what is the level of education, public education, family education, the mother's education, which is very important, so that we protect ourselves from these viruses. These viruses are forever available. By the way, these viruses are not lethal to these habitats where they live. By the way, we have viruses in our mouths, in our GI system, on our skins. Some of these bacteria and viruses don't hurt us because our body is aware of them, and we have antibody and protection against.
But I can see people and hear people in the audience saying, well, when you have people dying, it does impact us. And you asked a very interesting question. Does the Ebola virus have a right to live, I believe is what you asked? And my response as I heard your question was, it depends on what's the price that has to be paid for Ebola to survive. Now, not totally clear as that's a very interesting question, and I anticipated an interesting question coming from you when I read about your resume. Again, you've been educated in 4 different continents, but that's a very, very deep, what I call a deep question. So let me go back to that question. You asked, does the Ebola virus have the right to live? Can you explain that a little bit more for our audience who might be wondering the same thing?
What I meant to say is, if you look at the WHO's report, the main killer...
And I'm sorry, Belai, so some of the audience may not know what WHO is.
Okay, the World Health Organization is an organization of the United Nations, which is headquartered in Switzerland, works across the world. There is PAHO here in the Western continent. It's near GW, just at the State Department, actually near the State Department, 23rd and State Department. So these institutions is across the world. What I was trying to say was that these viruses exist in animals, and one of the most important things that we should do is to make sure that our habitat, our ecosystem protects the animals, the viruses in their environment, and we in our environment. Therefore, our opportunity to be in touch with these viruses is when we actually invade the territory of the animals and the viruses. And therefore, we need to be educated about it. Even now, regardless of how brilliant we are, we cannot stop this virus. We cannot eradicate this virus. What we can do is we can protect the human body, the human population, from being exposed to the virus. And I think that is also where the prevention should happen and where the solution should be. That means we create an appreciation, understanding in the human population how to deal with other creatures besides ourselves as we live here on planet Earth. Well, and as such, what I'm saying is we need to prevent contact with the virus. Now, this is very important nowadays because people are so miseducated. They feel the virus is coming from Africa, therefore everybody that's coming from Africa has this virus, and this is not true. This happened 30 years ago, in 1985. I was in London when the HIV virus came, and the National Health Service sent out a letter to all homes in every place saying the virus comes from Africa, so be careful of Africans. And we protested. That was enough, based on fact. And so we, instead of understanding the relationship between humans and animals, between viruses, parasites, bacteria, and ourselves, if you, by any misfortune, become sick, my job as a human being is to look after you. And in so doing, to make sure that you do not infect other people, or the infection doesn't pass from you to other people.
Time is moving on,
to
Belai.
label all people.
Excuse me, but time is moving on. Let me ask you some other quick questions. I want to go back to your question. I'm asking questions. assuming I was in the audience watching this program, you talked about protecting the animals. Now, I would probably use the term maybe respecting them in the proper context. But I just want to make sure everybody understands when you say protecting the animals, because, and I want to kind of keep this in the context of Africa, West Africa, because that's where the Ebola virus kind of started, and that's what this discussion is all about. Now, because the animals, you talk about protecting, obviously a lot of the animals, they're used for food, okay? So again, the context of protecting the animals. And you're raising some very interesting points, but again, I want to try to narrow this into what's going on with the Ebola. Now, the animal rights individuals who might see this show, they may be calling you, because a lot of people want to protect animals. But in the context of Ebola, help me out. What do you mean when you say protect the animals? Because some people might be saying, well, wait a minute, we're supposed to be protecting human beings.
Well, I come from Ethiopia, the mother of humanity, and for that matter, where all living beings evolved over time. As you know, we humans, according to science, have evolved from other animals and from other lives. And really, sometimes we become a little bit disrespectful of even the little insects and the little animals around us. But they play a very vital role. And the relationship between us, humans, and animals, between animals, parasites, viruses, and bacteria, need to be maintained. We need to do research to appreciate, because we need them for our survival. The bacteria that's in our gut helps us digest our food. However, the bad bacteria, the bacteria to which our body doesn't have immune system, gives us disease. So you can see the symbiosis, the relationship is very, very vital. We don't know. We need to know more. But one of the challenges in Africa now is that wild animals have been, exposed to lots of human interference to the extent that we're having lots of extinctions. The extinctions of these animals eventually would be our own extinction as well if we're not careful. So what I'm saying in effect is, yes, we should separate the habitats of the viruses and the bacteria and the parasites, the animals and humans. However, if we interfere in their lives, these bacteria have to survive, and therefore if they are in contact with us, they will thrive in us. You cannot create poisons to wipe out all these little animals or
look,
microbes.
Belai, I agree. I mean, look, I remember, I'm going back to my Peace Corps days. I remember, because things were quiet in my little mud brick hut, and I was watching a spider. It was just fascinating to see how they closed up that web. I called it packing it up. Maybe they were moving away, but it was intriguing. But I still have to ask you this. Animals, again, they're used for food for a lot of people. And I understand what you're saying about respecting animals. Can you give us an example of maybe some animal that may be extinct now or on its way to extinction that you feel could have a tremendous impact on mankind?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Most of us thrive because of the bacteria in our system, for which we take antibiotics, try to kill all this bacteria in our system. And then a new set of bacteria habit our biological system, and therefore we become very vulnerable. So what I'm trying to share with you is that we have to have a balance in our ecosystem, where we respect the ecology, the living things in it, including humans. This habit of killing, trying to eradicate other beings, doesn't stop with animals. It then comes to us. What's happening now in the United States, the current hotspot, is about the immigration of people from the south to here or from other countries to here. The same thing is happening in Europe and in Africa. And if you start saying us and them to such an extent whereby you feel humans have precedence over animals, and then within humans different races have precedence over others, then there will be nothing to stop us. However, if we have the culture of respecting others, we will be respecting the Native Americans' great-great-grandchildren who gave us the opportunity to live in this country. Today, we, the new immigrants, are saying to the children and great-grandchildren of Native Americans who come from Mexico and other places, you have no right to be here. And yet they welcomed us. Thanksgiving is about welcoming the stranger. So in the same setting, these wild animals and other things, we do not know what benefit they have for us. For now, we are threatened because there is a conflict of...
All right, let me take the discussion a step further. I'm going to piggyback on your point about not knowing how to really maybe respect the animal system. If you were president of the world, give me 3 recommendations you would make for human beings to respect animals from a health perspective.
I think the most important thing is to appreciate we are interconnected. All living things are interconnected. In fact, the whole ecosystem. You know, this table that you see in front of us, the wood some time ago had a life. And the life of that wood needed to the sustenance of the environment around it. So we share the whole ecosystem. So the first thing I would do, personally, is to make sure that we protect all living things. We're going to the moon. We're going even on comets. The European Space Agency was jumping from one comet to the other using Rosetta to see if there's life on this dead planet. Our planet is full of life. We don't care about the life here on Earth, but we're looking for oxygen and water in some comet somewhere else in another galaxy. This is the divine place in the universe which God has given us. And that is what I really believe. Our divinity depends on our ability to serve others in diversity. Biodiversity, socioeconomic diversity, and ecological diversity. This beautiful planet is perhaps the most important heaven on earth or in the universe that we need to appreciate.
And again, Belai, we need to maybe do a week show. I know this hour is not going to work for us because you're making some very interesting point. But look, you talk about protect everything. There are consequences, Belai. For example, as you were talking, my thought was, that coat that you're wearing, it probably came from some animal, unless it's some man-made material. Maybe your shoes. So these things that your brief bag there looks like it's leather. So it probably came from an animal. So, and look, I'm on the same page with you when you talk about balance. But this is an intriguing balance to try to reach. But you talk about protect everything. But in protecting everything, that would also mean that maybe certain benefits that we have now, we would have to do without. And people around the world, the question I would have is, are people willing to sacrifice certain benefits, whether it's a nice pair of leather shoes, a nice suit, wool suit, or whatever, to protect animals?
You see, I look at Ebola as a blessing in disguise. It is a unique phenomenon that is happening that is questioning our relationship with each other. Whenever danger comes, be it from the virus or bacteria, how we react to each other. The story that what happened here in the United States when an African Liberian came to Dallas, and then when the doctors came from Dallas, the way they were received and the way the media treated these two people, human beings. The only difference is one has an American passport, the other one has an African passport. Otherwise, they're both human beings. They both have the Ebola virus in them. But the way we reacted, in fact, the whole campaign of the 2014 midterm election was ISIS and Ebola. And instead of respecting each other and looking at what common future do we have, how can we actually prevent the virus from entering into humans and then from one human to another, it became a different situation. So I look at Ebola as a blessing in disguise. And the knowledge and the scientific really facts, which is very important, is the best thing is to make sure the relationship between Ebola and humans in Africa is maintained such that the virus doesn't jump into humans. Whereas once it goes into humans, it's very easy to spread across all humans around the world. So I'm looking at this opportunity to look at ourselves and say, humans to humans, do we respect each other?
Well, That's a very, very important and valid question. But I don't really think we really have to, we don't really have to use Ebola as a blessing. What about, and you don't have to answer this, but slavery? Okay, so we don't really have to say Ebola is a blessing. Then I have to ask you, for those who have lost loved ones, is Ebola a blessing? I hear what you're saying, Belai, in terms of respecting human beings, one another, which is kind of fascinating. Because again, you've studied medicine in four different continents, and it sounds like to me you're adding a new dimension to the field of medicine that perhaps is just not a very well talked about area, and that is basic human respect, giving human beings their respect and their due. And I can't argue with that. That's a very valid point. I'm not sure if mainstream America or mainstream around the world, if that's an area of discussion that they're having. So maybe this is a great opportunity that you're putting it out there. Other people will hear about it and will move forward with it.
I will raise only one issue, why I feel passionately about this. In Ferguson, a young African-American child has been shot and killed. And that officer is not brought to justice yet. And yet, President Obama, who actually said, let's be humane to these neighbors of ours who are amongst us. They're not only Latins, they are Africans, they're Europeans, they are British, they are Irish, they're from all over the world. Let's respect each other, let's keep the family together. Because he said that, they want to prosecute him. They want to impeach him. And yet, we have someone who has killed someone. Proof, I mean, there's no doubt about it. Yet, we are sitting here waiting, would they ever prosecute that guy? Can you see why I feel Ebola is important for us to look at ourselves face to face and say, do we respect each other? Well, is human life as valuable as the Ebola life is?
And human life definitely is more valuable. And look, all your points, Belai, is, I mean, I can respect what you're saying in terms of immigration, in terms of what's going on in Ferguson. He shouldn't have been on the street for 4 hours when he was shot. So I'm on the same page with you there. Now, what I find interesting is really what you're saying to me is you're talking about an element of racism that's impeding the best health system possible that we could have around the world.
I worked with Mrs. Clinton. In fact, how I came to this country is I used to work with Margaret Thatcher's government in the National Healthcare Reform in London at Paddington, North East Thames Regional Health Authority, where we were looking at the future and say, how can we make the technology, the new advances in healthcare profitable to everybody? And as part of that exercise, when President Clinton was trying to reform the healthcare, I wrote a letter straight to the White House and said, look, I have this experience working here. Can I contribute something? And I wrote the Universal Healthcare Reform Agenda. I got a card from Mrs. Clinton saying, please, I've got only 2 weeks. This was in April 1993. Can you come or can you send me a proposal? So I took that to the American Embassy. They gave me a visa. I came here, sat at George Washington University for 3 weeks. I wrote a universal healthcare policy by looking at all healthcare systems around the world, Europe, Africa, Asia, here Canada, and the United States. And as soon as I gave that report, something happened. The Republicans, especially the insurance companies, actually, sabotaged the whole process.
Interesting point.
And then that's how I stayed here.
Okay.
Why I say that is, we need to respect the human body, humans across the board, whether you're rich or poor, whether you're colored or not, or whatever your ancestry, your language, your culture is. If we do that, then we will have a universal health care. Imagine one of the reasons why that Liberian guy couldn't make it is because he did not have insurance. So he went to the hospital, he told them he had fever, he told them he was from Liberia. They did not want to admit him. Like they do now, every day, they give you antibiotic and send you home.
Again, you're making an interesting point. And what you're saying, again, is related to racism. And we know that certain people, you don't even have to have Ebola. For some folks, if you're from Africa, they automatically put up this wall that is something inferior about you, or you may give some kind of disease or something. So that's an area of ignorance that's very hard to combat.
However, sir,
But
I come from Ethiopia, the mother of humanity. And my message here to our audience and to you is Africans are the mothers of humanity and civilization. The Ethiopian Egyptian civilization was the foundation of the world civilization. And
look,
therefore, Africans...
and we're on the same page there. But what I'm saying is, and time is moving on, we got about 10 minutes. I'm going to take an extra couple minutes on this because this is fascinating. And don't get me wrong, because I say we got that degree of ignorance, please don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean we don't try to find ways to combat it, because it's not fair. And one thing we try to do on this show is we try to talk about how can things be fair in this world, especially to people of color. But let me real quick, and then we're going to wrap this up. And then because you work with Marion Barry,
Yes,
we're going to talk a little bit about him. But real quick, when I was doing some research last night on Ebola, I read something where it talked about how the virus can get into the mother's breast milk. Can you, which is kind of fascinating, as well as the semen. And so I was just wondering, are those two areas whereby the Ebola virus could be passed on and maybe people not even aware of what's going on?
Well, the virus goes into our system and it spreads through the bloodstream anywhere, everywhere in our body. That's true of all viruses, bacteria, and what have you. And therefore, when we say body fluids, it could be, from our skins. There are, millions of pores in our skin. So our skin is a porous surface. And then all the openings in our body, our eyes, our nose, our nostrils, our mouth, our anal system, and what have you. So any fluid exchange from our system potentially can have the virus. So as you said, could be milk, it could be fluid from the sexual organs, both male and female, could be the gastrointestinal system through our eyes. In fact, after a while, you start bleeding in your skin directly. So the virus, the human body becomes its home. The virus spreads. So you're right, sir, it spreads by body fluid contact.
Okay, quick question for you. Again, if you had the power, if someone asked you, excuse me, if you had the financial power and decision-making power, and someone say, well, should we, I know breast milk is supposed to be the best milk for children.
Yes.
Would that be appropriate to maybe suggest that in these areas where Ebola has been present, to introduce mothers to other kind of milk options?
Well, this is what the pharmaceuticals used to do, and I trained in pediatrics, whereby, as you know, in developing countries, infectious diseases are very common. I was going to talk about this. If you look at the WHO's story about Africa, the main killer is HIV. It kills about 1 million people per year. That means on a regular basis. Next comes respiratory diseases, mainly pneumonias, chest infection, then diarrhea, then TB, then malaria. And by the way, these are all zoonotic. They come from mosquito to us. And then, as you know, the avian viruses, chicken from, very recently from Denmark, they were killing lots of chicken. China, Asia, Middle East. And so even here in the United States, since then, the bacterial infections are killing more people. So what I'm saying in terms of scale, Ebola is very, very, it's killing very few people. However, the mortality rate is high, 50% or higher. Anybody who's infected doesn't survive unless you have treatment. So putting the whole thing together, what I'm sharing with you is Ebola is something new, but it's not new. 40 years, at least, since we came to know Ebola as being harmful to people. But there are other viruses and bacteria that's killing people in this country.
Yeah, Belai, I really hate to have to kind of interrupt you because I'm enjoying this. I could sit here all day. But we only have a few minutes left. And unfortunately today, we got about 7 minutes left. Unfortunately today, November 23rd, from what I understand, I think about 1:46 a.m. this morning, a dear friend of Africa's Vision Network, the former mayor, Marion Barry, passed away. A gentleman who did so much for African Americans and the world. He's known for some things that maybe he's made the news for, but there's more to him than that. You mentioned earlier that you had an experience with Mr. Barry. I'd like to take just a couple minutes for you to share your experience with Mr. Barry.
Yes, Marion Barry was the mayor. In fact, I used to work with the Department of Health with Dr. Akhtar, who was the director of public health at the time, with the early intervention program. And we had some federally funded resources to help children with disabilities, and then to help what we call the medical home, so that everybody would have a primary health care doctor. And then I also worked with the CDC. So we had CDC money and NIH money. And when Sharon Pratt Kelly left and he came in, the government was in the red and there was no money. So our funds were taken to accommodate some of the city's needs. So I went and spoke to him. And what he said to me, I would never forget. He says, we are in trouble now, there's not enough money in the city. And therefore, he said, just be patient. I will look around to see if I can get resources from somewhere else to cover these issues. And then I left the Department of Health. I was working with the private sector. Again, I had contact with him. What I saw in him was always wanting to help and saying, give me a little time, I will talk to the private sector if I can raise some funds. So he was the type of person, he would never say no. He would say, I'll try my best, just give me time. And so he had this unique personality to serve others and always wanting to see how he can, bring resources to the community.
And you know, Belai, that's really great to hear, because he always, from what I observed, seemed to put his finger on some of the really troubling challenges in certain neighborhoods, in particular African-American neighborhoods.
Yes.
You talk about developmental delays for the children.
Yes.
I mean, we've seen that played out in these shootings across the country.
Yes.
Now, I have to ask you this real quick. What term was that when you were communicating with Mayor Barry? He was, as you know, mayor 4 times. I'm curious as to, was it in his early term or later terms?
No, this was right after Sharon Pratt Kelly has left and he's come in, and he was a new mayor at that time when I met him. This was in 1993, 94.
Okay. So at least, I can't remember the timeline, but he had been mayor before Sharon Pratt Kelly.
Oh, yes. Yeah. This was the second time.
Here's the reason I'm asking, because I'm kind of tying it to what you were saying earlier. You said the funding dried up.
Yes.
Look, I got to admit, I was in a meeting once, and you talked about how he had to go to New York. I was in a meeting once where individuals were talking about how the city bonds and things like that were impacted because there was one man in office. They didn't call the man's name in this particular meeting, but everybody knew he was talking about Marion Barry. But here's the beautiful thing I want to add to, because we're really running out of time here. Belai, you talked about the children, because that's what this is all about. Whether it's in Africa, Ethiopia, Liberia, in America, London, Asia, it's all about the children. And this is what I respected about Marion Barry. The job program that he gave to so many young kids in Washington, D.C., who are now successful. The Pride operation that he had. And I'll share this with you, Belai, and you've dealt with mom and children, so maybe you can relate this. But one of the things I admired about Marion Barry when I did the interview with him, one of the questions that I asked, and he lit up like a Christmas tree, I said, Mr. Barry, how is your mother doing? And he lit up like a Christmas tree and like the 4th of July. And I've always said, you find a man who loves his mother, it's a man with a good heart. Can you quickly comment on that as we get ready to wrap this up?
Yes, sir. I really believe mothers are the most important resource, gift. I even say they're divine. I call the divine feminine, who actually protect us. If at all there was God who created the universe, in our planet, anybody who is able to bring forth life are women and mothers. And I currently work in DC with grandmothers who looked after these disabled kids and others, and who have nobody to look after them. So the story of mothers is very, very important. And Marion Barry, I would say, the best way to remember him is to create a foundation that remembers his life and what he did, so that we will create more Mariam Barrys in the district and around the world.
Well, that's interesting too, because there's a little title I was playing around with, Belai, maybe you can relate to this. And it was something like The Last Dance for Kids of Color. And Mariam Barry's last dance was this morning at 1:46 a.m. on November 23rd for kids, because that's who were the beneficiaries. Yes, the adults too. And like you said, we need more Mariam Barrys. I was driving over and I saw a Lexus car in front of me, and somehow I said, you know, Omar, I didn't see Mr. Barry riding around in a Lexus. He was a chemist. He probably could have got into the material things, but he sacrificed his life for the good of others. And for those who may be critical and may be celebrating his life of passing away in a negative way, I would strongly suggest they look past that event that made the news, because there's more to Mariam Barry than what got into the news.
Sir, this is happening all over the time. Whenever somebody is sacrificing his life for the good of others, there will be others who look to bring him down, and therefore they'll look in his weak points. All of us humans have weak points, and really we have to look at the good things that he did. And for that, I would say maybe one of the things we should do is remember Mariam Barry by creating a foundation that remembers some of the good things he did for the city and for people of color, and for that matter, for humanity. I would hope and pray there would be more of us like Mariam Barry who will take up the courage and work for the children, for those who are marginalized, vulnerable people. And since the topic was Ebola as well, I hope the lesson of Ebola should be to all of us the little virus that is no DNA itself. It can't even replicate itself unless it's in somebody else's DNA. If it can shake us up like this, imagine if all us, the people, put our resources together and stand up for our cause, so that everybody will have our own enterprises. I always say, when Obama was giving that money to TARP, 1.5 trillion to those rich guys, I wish he gave it to Small Business Initiative and gave it to all of us, so that we could get access to enterprises.
Well, Belai, perhaps someone from Obama's cabinet and maybe even the next administration will see this program, and a lot of great things you've mentioned. You mentioned the foundation. You seem like you would be a great person to lead the foundation, to be the chairperson of the foundation, because it takes leaders to implement things. And clearly your travel and you're living in 4 different continents. So I'm gonna nominate you, Belai, to take the lead on this foundation.
Let me say this.
I'll join you.
To be fair to Mariam Barry and others, whenever African leadership comes up, there will be others who are trying to pull us down. Currently, our president, who's done so much, really, perhaps he's going to have a great legacy, is going to be pulled down by others. Therefore, one of the things we would do for Mariam Barry, we should do for our president too. The more successful Africans and African Americans and people of color we have on the planet,
I agree.
The more example we give to our kids.
And I agree. Again, I could talk to you the whole week. The other thing, because you're absolutely right, Belai, because real quick I want to say, I read this article, it was a tabloid, maybe it's not true, that President Obama had a mental breakdown. Now these tabloids, they will say all these different kind of things.
When did that happen?
Well, it was in the newspaper this week, but one thing I want to say is perhaps we all should send a card or some kind of note to the president, because he has been under tremendous pressure just to say thank you, happy holiday, or whatever, because we all need encouragement. And so I want to go back to with Mariam Barry. I know he had mentioned when he was on the show that he was also reaching out to Africa. So he really had a connection with the motherland.
Yes.
So, but Belai, I want to thank you very much. I wish we had, Belai, guess what? I just found out that we got a little more time.
Okay.
10 minutes, about 10 minutes or so. So,
could I say one thing?
Sure.
Sir, this is a very, very dynamic time in history. And I think one of the things we need to say to the president and to Marion Barry's family and others is that we respect them. We will give them support in every way we can, and to make sure they appreciate that they're loved, because that is the most important thing. If we respect each other, you would be surprised, we can do miracles. So as we think of Marion Barry's family, who would be mourning today, we should dedicate ourselves to say, we will create more Marion Barrys, more Obamas, more great people like that. Both you and I should actually encourage that type of environment. So I just wanted to make sure that at least in this meeting, we have a small virus, Ebola, that's threatening us. But really, the real challenge is each other. The disrespect that we have for each other is worse than that little Ebola virus. That virus would live very well with its own environment, but we need to respect each other.
Well, and Belai, the things that you've been saying, and some of it is sinking in, because look, let me give an analogy based on what I've heard you say. And I probably wouldn't have said this at the beginning of the show, but now I think I understand you a little bit better. Because a virus can be defined in different ways. What happened when we have innocent people shot down for no reason and killed? That's a virus. Because it's a killing that's not warranted. Look, I want to be clear. There are times when certain things have to be done. But we see too many situations where it's very questionable as to what happened. Look, and I can speak from experience, and you know, I like to back up my comments with my personal experience. I thank God that I'm still here today, in spite of an experience that I had in New York, Central Park. I thank God that the cop who hit me with a nightstick and split my face open decided to use a nightstick rather than a gun. For some reason, God intervened, and rather than that police officer using his gun, he used a nightstick. So I know, and I was doing nothing but trying to attend a concert. So I know from personal experience that there are innocent people out there. You mentioned another key word of love. Love is definitely missing. Now, you mentioned too, I want to say this early because we know people will be critical of others because Jesus Christ, people criticize him. I do want to ask you this. We may not have time to finish this. But there's one thing, too, where I think you talked about respect. There's another piece that I think where we've disrespected President Obama. And I've said this before on my show. I heard on the news how they talk about the first black president. I've always had issues with that. Why? We talked about mothers. President Obama's mother was Caucasian. I think that everybody who calls him a black man, they're showing disrespect to his mother, who was white. President Obama, in my opinion, is a black-white president. We just can't write off his mother just because she was white. We can't write off his grandparents who were white, who clearly had a big impact in his life, and he had all kinds of love for them. So I think white America, black America, any other human being who's sticking the title on him of being black, there's an element of disrespect. We cannot just toss his mother to the side, toss his other family members to the side. And if I had a conversation with the president, if I was so fortunate, that is one fault that I would also say, Mr. President, I think you've done a disservice to your mother and your grandparents. That's just my opinion.
Sir, I come from Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, we don't have black, white, red, and yellow. My parents had me and my brother. My brother is much darker than you or anything, or me or anybody. And in the Ethiopian setting, from the same family, you could have people very light-skinned, tall, blue eye, brown eye, black eye. So this disease, as I call it, is an American disease. It's not even there in Europe. Who created it? Why? Is a bit funny. To me, I have a son, and I always tell him, I'm from the Potomac tribe, and he laughs. He says, what does that mean? So as we drive by Potomac, well, There were people before we came, or before, I guess I sort of joke with them, before you people came. My people were here before you, so you better respect. So we went to a little park in Alexandria, it says Potomac Park. And then somewhere else it says the Newfound Park. And he asked me, what does that mean? You see, someone is not respecting our people. I say this in a joke.
Right.
Why I say that is the Native Americans gave us the privilege to come and live here. There were people who lived here. There was a civilization before us. Those of us who came are guests to the Native Americans. As guests, we should be also good guests to others who are coming after us. So coming to the president, I believe, to be fair, President Obama, really almost 99.9% culturally and biologically and what have you, is born an American, and therefore his mom, his grandparents are the ones who raised him. However, by his very nature, because he wants to side with those who are in need,
Well,
he had
Belai,
been labeled
I have to
black and what have you.
Excuse me for cutting across you, but I have to say this. I'm not sure if that's what he's decided or if the system has forced him into that position, because everybody has somewhat placed him there. We don't really know what's in his heart. And you mentioned 99%. If it's not
Culturally, I meant.
yeah, but that 1% is very important. But Belai, this has been really a treat. When I saw your long resume, I'm thinking, okay, this this is going to be kind of interesting. But Belai, let's talk about this too. While you, we seem like we got a couple more minutes. I want to talk about this issue that was important to the mayor about children with developmental delays. Let's talk about tuberous sclerosis complex, which I talked to you off camera, quite frankly. That was something that was noted on an MRI with my son. And the manifestations have been identified as seizures, which was pretty obvious, autism, obsessive compulsive behavior, certain skin lesions, and there was a fifth one I can't come up with that right now. And from what I understand, you don't necessarily have to have manifest all of those, but in his case, it sounds like all of those have been manifested. And because these tubers, from what this MRI has said, the neurologist, I have to be honest with you, I had to go to 2 neurologists. I found that this TSC, because not a lot of people are familiar with it, they seem not to take it very serious. Can you talk briefly about that, because time is...
All right. I want to just say in general terms, because this is going to be very specific, your question. In general terms, all of us, as we develop in utero, we have the opportunity to, our cells have the opportunity to grow. And what happens is, depending on how the cellular environment, is it acidic or is it basic? Or
I'm sorry, you're talking about the wound, is that correct?
in the womb,
Yeah,
as
so
the
everybody
baby
knows.
is,
Right,
yes,
right.
as the baby is,
Developing.
as the cells are multiplying, more or less, developing, especially in the first few weeks of life. That's the most critical time. In that time, what was the mother's womb environment? Of course, genetic factors matter, but also the development environment is also important.
Okay.
So what happened is, in that critical
I'm sorry.
time is where the changes happen, and therefore, what I want to say in general.
And then wrapping up, so
Yes.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to
I'll
wrap
only
it up.
want to say this.
I'll bring you back. I don't think
Yes.
we have the time, unfortunately.
Let me say one thing on
Real
it.
quick.
All of us have a lot of ability. We also have lots of disabilities. Some we know, some we don't know.
Okay.
So we have to thank God for our disabilities and for our abilities as well.
Well, and you're right. And look, and thank you. And I'm sorry I had to kind of cut this short, because it's truly interesting. But especially when we talk about what's going on with our kids, because we look at the mental health issues, we look at all these mass killings by young people. So it seems like that's definitely an area that we really need to focus on and get a better handle on, so that we can perhaps prevent some of these horrible killings. But Belai, thank you very much.
I thank you very much.
And look forward to having you back, and we'll be talking more. But thank you very much, and may God bless you, and appreciate your comment too about the late Mayor and Barry, who passed away
Yes.
today.
May the Lord bless his family and his loved ones. and especially our president, who is under pressure at the moment. That means all of us are under
Exactly.
pressure, and may the Lord bless this country. And
Right. And we're going to reach out to our audience that, again, feel free to send the president a letter of encouragement. But thank you very much for watching the program, and please join us on our next program. Thank you.